What a joy to be able to talk together this afternoon about Shusaku Endo's novel, Silence, and the powerful opportunity we have to encounter that through the forthcoming film of Martin Scorsese this year. Makoto Fujimura, it's a joy to be with you and talk about your reflections. And what a joy to have Neal Plantinga, Nicholas Wolterstorff here in this conversation together. I wonder if we could each begin by some reflections on our first encounter with Shusaku Endo's novel and how it's functioned in our own life and teaching. Neal, I'm wondering if you could begin.
Sure. For, I guess, 13 or 14 years, I've hosted a group of preachers to read general literature. In about 2008, we began to read Shusaku Endo's Silence, a novel set in 17th century Japan and featuring Portuguese missionaries who are viewed by Japanese as a threat, not just a gift. So they become persecuted in horrendous ways. And one of the ways the Japanese attempt to discourage Christians is by trying to get their leaders to betray their faith. In the end, there is a profound challenge laid before priest Father Rodriguez. He has an opportunity to save their lives if he will only step on, tread on, trample a fumier, a bronze plate with the image of Jesus or of the Virgin Mary engraved on it. So it's a powerful novel. It's the novel about which years later I get emails and phone calls and comments and conversations because preachers, having read it and discussed it, are haunted by it for years to come.
I read Shusaku Endo's Silence very early on as an undergraduate. I found it fascinating that this novel was well known in the States, but didn't understand or think much about the faith element until I went to Japan as a graduate student, as a national scholar, studying 17th century Japanese art. There was this side room at the National Museum of these blocks, and I had no idea what they were, and I read the description, and it said these were fumiers, stepping blocks from 17th century, of how they identify Christians to persecute them. And when that happened, I had just been baptized in a missionary church in Japan through my wife's influence. And I write in my book, Silence and Beauty, that this was my true baptism, that God was speaking through history, through art, about the traumas of the past, and of course the connection between Endo's book and the fumier became very clear to me, starkly clear to me at that point. So I reread the novel both in English and Japanese at that point, and it was very traumatic reading it as a brand new believer. What's haunting about the fumiers when you see them today is that they are worn smooth. So many have stepped on them over the 250 years of persecution that you can hardly recognize the faces of Jesus or Virgin Mary. So that will never leave me, and but frankly, it's a story that I didn't want to encounter again. And this film coming out, I began this journey back about 2-3 years ago with Endo, and I'm grateful for that.
Right. Nick, how about your first encounters with the novel and how it's factored in your teaching and work?
I just found it gripping because of this unbelievably pernicious form of torture. We won't torture you if you refuse to step on the fumier and betray Christ. We will torture your fellow Japanese Christians. But then I found occasion to employ it in my teaching. I was at Yale. I was teaching the course in theological aesthetics. And as part of the course, there was a section on the Byzantine icons. And there was something in me that said, you should really get at the loser side of of the story of the Byzantine iconoclastic controversy, as well as the winner side. The winner side is very easy to get at. And I'm trying to get these students to have some feeling, these mostly Protestant, to have some feeling for why a Byzantine person, an Orthodox person would kiss an icon, would prostrate himself, herself in front of it, bow, and so forth. So I'm trying to wax eloquent. Woman raises her hand and says, I don't get it. I don't get it. It's just wood and paint, and well, I don't get it. Why do they kiss these things? So it finally occurred to me to say, would you stomp on a picture of your mother? I wouldn't stomp on a picture of my mother. I love my mother. It's only a piece of paper. I wouldn't stomp on a picture of my mother. And in order to get the discussion going, I quote, I think it's probably 2 pages from Endo's Silence, the crucial part in which Rodriguez finally steps on the fumier.
Wonderful.
I say Endo is a novelist of pain, but he's not a novelist of despair. He's a novelist of compassion. He wants to give voice to the voiceless. That's why he intentionally picked the character of Father Chiara, Father Rodriguez, historic character whose name is buried in Japanese history. And there's a little plaque where he is buried, supposedly, but they probably scattered the ashes so that the church would not find the remains. So this person who completely lost his voice when he apostatized or when he stepped on the fumier, he probably himself said, no one is going to hear the story, not even Rome. He's going to be completely erased from history. And yet, Endo wrote a novel based on this fragment of information of this voiceless character who is, by all account, is a loser. Why, right? Well, it was partly because Endo's compassion led him to this point, but it was also he knew that the only way that people going through trauma can find hope is to identify with people who went through failures. He himself realized, and he talks about this many times, that he as a Catholic in Japan are spiritual children of people who stepped on the fumier, people who abandoned their faith, people who, in order to survive. So Catholic Church in Japan exists partly due to the fact of all these people who deny their faith. So what I hope for the audience, both in terms of Scorsese's efforts, I think, which will be very faithful to the text of Endo, is that this layers and layers of despair be replaced by compassion. That we understand that, as we look back into history, today in America, we're experiencing trauma. We're experiencing loss of identity, many, many betrayals. We have our own fumiers that we step on. And yet, at the end of the day, the story is not about us. The story is about this extraordinary grace of God to work through history, to resurrect a voiceless, apostate priest, make that voice into the bestseller in Japan, the most unlikely of it thing, to make his voice be the bestseller in the world, global bestseller, and then make his voice shout over the rooftops of Hollywood. to cast his voice, Father Rodriguez, played by Andrew Garfield, the Spider-Man, to project that into the world and to let the world know that every single person, oppressed, persecuted, dismissed by society, that voice can be heard.
Mako, I'm wondering if you could take us to the end of the novel, this moment of ambiguity and take us into that scene and what you've learned about that through your encounter, especially as you've now written this beautiful book reflecting on the novel, your own work, Silence and Beauty.
Yeah, I tell people, encouraging, of course, to read the original book by Endo and read it to the end. Many people don't, I found. There is a gap between the end of the story and the beginning of this letter, but Endo does not say appendix. It is the main part of his book. And in many of his lectures, when he encounters questions such as, well, this book is a book of despair, existentialist book of despair, he says, well, you haven't read the book to the end. And I think that's very significant, knowing the ambiguity, which is so powerfully present at the end. This is the artistry of Endo, is to bring the reader first into a certain path of condemnation, to condemn the characters, whether it be Kichijiro betraying his family and his countrymen, betraying his faith many times over, and pitiful in how he keeps coming back, and it's a nuisance to Father Rodriguez, but how his character is a setup for the reader to judge. And Endo says repeatedly, Kichijiro is me, and the way I even judge myself, you know. So this is a very intentional setup by Endo, and I say in the book Silence and Beauty that Endo is like a mystery novelist, sets up his 5 clues. They're all misleading. And at the end, the reader realizes that what he or she thought to be the meaning of this book, the direction of how we are to interpret, is all wrong. And that adds to the confounding the ambiguity at the end. Because the reader is put in a place where he or she is not sure the interpretation lens that you have to use at that point. And at that point, there's a kind of inversion of first of all, the character of Father Rodriguez, which is so beautifully written. It is also this unwinding of what we do to each other when we are under duress, what we do to each other under war conditions, and
what we do for each other.
For each other, right? And this is a psychological drama that forces the reader to say that, yes, I have stepped on that fumie too. It may not be a religious icon, but I stepped on my mother. I betrayed my mother. I betrayed my friends. I betrayed myself. And this is why Endo's book, you know, which is the most improbable of all bestsellers to come out of Japan, because it offends everybody. It offends the Japanese for recounting their past atrocities. It offends the church, Catholic Church in Japan wanted to ban this book. It offends just about everybody, and yet it resonated with people who still suffering in their traumas, still trying to figure out how do I deal with my betrayals, my loss, how am I supposed to move on? And the ambiguity of the end of Silence actually allows the reader to step in to that story.
There's actually another ambiguity inside the big ambiguity, and that is in the scene in which it appears that the Christ of the fumie speaks to Rodriguez and says, go ahead, it's okay, I can take it. And the question is whether this is
It was for this that I came.
is
Yes,
for
yes,
this
that's
that I
right.
came. Whether this is an actual revelation of some kind or whether it's sheer self-deception.
Yes, yes.
To
And
justify what he's
that adds to the ambiguity.
Yeah.
We're not quite sure.
Yeah.
We're not quite sure.
One thing that might happen for at least thoughtful Christians, it will relativize their understanding of Christians who have fallen.
Yes.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So, you know, pastors who are found in adultery or who knows, the
Yep.
people that now have gathered to themselves horrible publicity. And the tendency is for the rest of us to ignore them, to separate ourselves from them because their shame is
Yep.
contagious in
Yep.
some way.
Yeah.
But now maybe we relativize that and think of Father Rodriguez and of how, in some ways, he is, by grace, rehabilitated.
And this is a recurring theme for Shusaku Endo. You know, it's reported that he did not receive the Nobel Prize because his novel Scandal has just come out, and he's exploring this theme of public figure betraying the public. So he was constantly focused on this dilemma of Christianity, its message of the God for the poor, God for the broken, Christ suffering with us, and juxtaposing that with the reality, cultural condition, which does not allow these deeper explorations to take place. And the church is the part of the problem of us inability, you know, and it's not to ignore the law, it's not to become antinomian, it's not to say that, well, it doesn't matter if you fall or not. There is some other language that the church needs to develop that actually gets at the heart of the gospel.
Yeah.
So many layers to the conversation. Thank you, Mako, for your book. Thank you, Neal and Nick, for the commentary.
You're welcome.
Wonderful conversation that we've shared. What a gift.